welcome to everybody to our Russia brief. Let me pull up my notes here. A project of the Center for Eurasian, Russian, and East European Studies at Georgetown University. And it is made possible, as always, by the generous support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I'm Jill Dougherty. I'm an adjunct professor at Georgetown at Ceres, and really glad to be here. This is the second in a four-part series of discussions about the war in Ukraine. And for astute followers, you remember that last month we began with an overview of the war, with an eyewitness to top-level discussions that precede between the United States and Russia that preceded just, very shortly before Moscow's invasion of Ukraine. That was Ambassador Sullivan. And today we're going to really focus on the military aspect and aspects of this war. And we're asking the question with a nod to Leo Tolstoy: how will the war define the peace? And our guest today is one of absolutely the best military experts in the United States, Dara Massicot, a senior policy researcher at the RAND Corporation and former senior analyst for Russian military capabilities at the Department of State. And we're really glad to have you with us here today, Dara. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. So we're going to talk roughly for about half an hour or so, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. And remember, if you have a question, and I'm sure there will be a lot, you can use the Q&A function on Zoom. So without further ado, I'd like to begin let's say with a scenario that's probably being played out every day in Kyiv and in Moscow. And that is, Dara, you are now a top general in the Ukrainian army, and you are briefing President Zelensky on the status of the fighting right now. So what do you tell him?
Well, first of all, thank you all so much for your time this morning, and thank you for inviting me. I apologize, I'm in kind of an austere location at the moment. I'm on the go in between panels, so I'm doing this from my cell phone. So thank you for your patience on that. So from the Ukrainian perspective, looking out on the Russian forces, they have shown an ability to understand and integrate the information that they're getting from the West with their own intelligence and information, and they tend to have a pretty good sense of where the Russian front line is pretty weak. So they're going to be looking at conditions, not only of the terrain, when are ground conditions optimal for a counteroffensive. They're also going to be looking at what's going on with all the defensive positions that the Russians are building. They're building hundreds of kilometers right now worth of tank traps, trenches, minefields, concrete barriers to try to slow down a Ukrainian counteroffensive. So they're going to take those kind of things into account. The real advantage that I think the Ukrainian command has over their Russian counterparts is I think they have the ability to communicate accurate assessments upwards to the civilian leadership of Ukraine. That characteristic is not necessarily present on the Russian side, and we've seen that lead to multiple problems for them. So, I probably wouldn't want to be an armchair general, but what I would say is that the Russian front line right now has a lot of people in it from mobilization. They've got 300,000 additional people. We don't know what those people will do when they are confronted with a counteroffensive. We saw this last year when the Russians were surprised up in Kharkiv. The whole front line up there collapsed. The Ukrainians were able to move quickly through, and chaos reigned, and it basically started collapsing in on itself. So I don't know if that's the situation that will present itself again. It's a little different now, so it may not present in that way. But again, these are untested people. They're mobilized. They're not trained professional soldiers. Switching tack from the Russian side, I'll break that into two different parts. There's what they probably should be telling the Kremlin, and then what they probably actually will tell the Kremlin. And they're distinct. What they should tell the Kremlin about their position is that their combat capability or their ability to press forward and fight successfully, and that's based on many different things like what is the status of my armored equipment? What is the status of my artillery shells? How many people do I have who are injured or wounded or rotating out and resting? That combat capability is degraded. They are struggling right now to even surround small towns like Bakhmut and Avdiivka. They've been working at this for a long time, and I think it speaks to the overall damaged nature of their offensive power on the ground. That's what they should communicate to the Kremlin is we need to stop pressing forward. This offensive is clearly beyond what we are able to do, and we need to go back onto the defensive and try to retain the areas that we're occupying. What I think they actually are going to tell the Kremlin, because again, Chief of the General Staff, Larry Gerasimov, is a loyalist to Putin and to himself. He's not necessarily providing very good advice, and we've seen this time and again from him over the last 15 months. I think he's probably going to tell Putin what he wants to hear, which is the counteroffensive is working, we just need more men, it's going to work out, we're going to attack 5 cities from 5 different ways and stretch our logistics and break them again, because that's kind of what he does. I don't get the sense that they are comfortable having difficult conversations with the Kremlin and telling them how bad that it is. There was a brief period of time, I think late last fall through January, when they had a commander in place who was different. Surovikin is his name. I think he was telling him accurate assessments, and then all of a sudden he's demoted and they bring Gerasimov back in charge. So there are a lot of quirks and dysfunctions in the Russian system, leading them to make suboptimal choices on the battlefield. And I think we've clearly been seeing that again since January when they ordered this offensive. So right there, I'll hold, but I do see it as Ukraine's advantage that they are able to articulate what's really happening.
Yeah, that's really, there's so many things that you brought up, and I think we'll get into that dysfunction and a little bit later. But just on the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, now, I have read that it is part of the plan could be to try to cut off the land route between Crimea and Russia. Do you believe that actually is an aim of theirs? Is it realistic? And if so, what would be the price of doing that?
So I don't know what the Ukrainians' plans are, and so I'll answer that from the Russian perspective, because you can look out and see there's such great work going on in social media right now, where people are able to use commercial imagery and different types of information and piece together where the Russians are trying to build a defensive line. And it extends all the way from the north up in Belgorod, which is Russia, not even occupied Ukraine, all the way through down to Crimea. And if you look at the areas of that line that are the thickest, where they're building the most trenches, the most minefields, the most physical barriers to slow down a counteroffensive, it is in that region, in Zaporizhia, which suggests that they are worried about that, where they do not want that land bridge to be severed. If the land bridge is cut and then the bridge to Crimea is cut, then Crimea is very vulnerable. The whole southern portion just becomes disconnected. So, I look at when the Russians are committing resources to modifying the ground like this, building not only just simple trenches in the dirt, but like actual wooden structures where people can live for a very long time. That's what they're concerned about right now, that particular stretch of land. So it'll be interesting to see what the Ukrainians do with that information, because they've shown that they're full of surprises.
Yeah. And just to close the loop on Crimea, there is this theory out there that, it's really existential for Putin to hold on to Crimea. And if it were in jeopardy, he might be tempted to use a nuclear device or start a war. What do you think about that?
Well, my understanding of Russian nuclear saber rattling and escalation points have changed over time throughout the course of this war. Every time there has been a major setback, whether that's the bridge getting attacked the first time, or part of the front collapsing in the fall, or having to withdraw, in the early part of the war, there was talk from Moscow about, "Well, we have nuclear weapons and we'll use them to defend ourselves." There wasn't any follow through. Um, Now, can we say that that circumstance will be the same in an event like that? I don't know. My What I think is, when they are able to spin their way out of something, they can walk it down, they can cool the temperature down. I don't know how they would spin domestically the loss of Crimea. I feel like that would be hard for him, even with complete control of the media, to put a positive spin on that. And then they start getting into a negative mental headspace. That's the political side of the equation. Militarily, even if they lost Crimea, there's nothing in Russian military doctrine that says that that would prompt a nuclear attack. I mean, I know they consider it Russia, but I think when push comes to shove, there's not a lot that we really understand about that specific decision.
Yeah. One very important thing that happened this week, in fact, just a couple of days ago, was the Russian parliament passing a law very quickly, extremely quickly, about mobilization. Actually, I should say, changing the way that it notifies men that they're being called up for the draft. And before, they had to, as probably most people in our audience know, they had to go physically, and deliver that notification. Now it will be electronic, and it pops up on a server for the government, Gosuslugi. And so even as soon as it posts, that person is officially notified, even if they haven't actually received the notification. So the implications of this are that it will be extremely difficult for anybody to avoid mobilization at this point. And there is a lot of concern, it appears, among young Russian men that they, again, could be the subject of mobilization. I actually saw one Russian member of the lower house, the Duma, who said that her name is Narusova. She is the mother of Ksenia Sobchak, who ran for the presidency of Russia a while ago. Anyway, she was the only one who voted against it. And she said, doing this and curtailing the rights of Russians is tantamount to martial law. So this is really a sensitive subject. Dara, I just really like your take on that, because to me, it's a big, check mark in the development here. The paranoia of the Kremlin is obvious, that they don't want to say another mobilization. They had one, a partial mobilization in September. But what do you think about this and the importance that they attach to getting as many people in uniform as possible?
This is a development. To back up a big step, Russia is taking step by step the necessary legal mechanisms that they need to do to transition the economy, to transition the country to something that approaches potentially a wartime footing. Now, when the Russian state mobilizes, and this is not just the military, but these are all, aspects of the state, there are multiple laws that need to change, and it's a process. I mean, there's many steps in this process. We've seen them in the past few months, really since, I guess we could probably say late last year, start to make some of these esoteric legislative changes, where it's tightening penalties on draft evasion, essentially putting a stop loss in place for everybody. No one can actually leave the military right now unless they're medically discharged. Threatening anything from increasing the penalties on the defense industrial base if they don't comply with state defense orders, to things like Medvedev inexplicably showing up to a tank factory wearing a full leather trench coat and threatening people, and reading, you know, a Stalin telegram on TV to all the heads of the defense industrial base. I mean, that's political theater, but the legislative changes are actually really troubling. And it shows that they're marching along this process to click over more authorities to the federal government. In Russia, mobilization and martial law actually go hand in hand. You can't necessarily have one without the other, at least in terms of how they conceptualize it doctrinally. So when I view this recent legislation, this is an attempt to clarify some of the mistakes that they made before last year with mobilization, where things were chaotic, paper summons, they couldn't find people, they were mobilizing the wrong people because they had a quota incentive system, and they've just passed mistakes up the chain until the chain fixed it and kicked things back down. Very chaotic. They won't make that mistake again. And that's what we've been seeing ever since. They want to make this shifting the burden to notification from the state to make sure that you have it, to now it's on you to check to see if you've received your summons. So they've shifted it onto the people. If you don't comply, there's all these penalties that come in on you. You have, I think it was 20 days to report. And if you don't report, you lose your driver's license. There's all sorts of issues that go on with your electronic pay. There's just weird things happening. Critically, you can't leave the country. Once you've been activated, you can't leave through any border crossing that's legitimate. And this is probably the last part I would say is these things are on the books. That doesn't necessarily mean that they have the capacity to enforce it in an ironclad way comprehensively. So do I think that people could still get out of Russia if they know the right border guard, if they're willing to bribe, or if they're willing to go through like a porous part of the border? If they're motivated to do so and they have the resources, yes, that's not going to be everybody. But I do see this in the context of them methodically stepping through a process to go over to a higher readiness and protracted war.
Yeah, it's really important. You know, you mentioned kind of the dysfunction of the regular military, and that raises in my mind the issue of Wagner, the private military contractor. And I know that PMCs, you know, and mercenaries have been part of war since, you know, Roman times, but this really does feel as if something has changed, because we actually have open verbal warfare between Mr. Prigozhin, who's the head of this private military contractor group, the Wagner Group, against the military. Putin seems to be kind of, you know, keeping, let's say, intervening in a fight between two boys. It must be very difficult for President Putin to manage this. So what is going on here? I mean, I guess that's the best formulation I can get for this. What is this? Why is it being allowed for Prigozhin to speak the way he is so openly? And does the, let's say the Russian government or military, do they really need, excuse me, the Wagner Group?
Yeah, so Wagner played an important role in the war, and it still is to some extent, although it's diminishing over time. It filled a gap when Russian manpower was falling apart because of their casualties last summer in particular. So Wagner would go to some of the more difficult battles and essentially serve as a band-aid and make some progress at that time. Now that the Russian military has mobilized and they have more people, even though they're not maybe super capable or trained, it is solving their manpower challenges. Their need for Wagner is shifting over time and diminishing. That's one side of it. There, I would say, are years of bad blood in between these two groups. So whether that's Defense Minister Shoigu or Chief of General Staff Gerasimov, some of his subordinates, and Prigozhin, this dates back from Syria times, you know, multiple years ago, and everywhere else Wagner is operating. There is bad blood, and on a personal level between Shoigu and Prigozhin. And I've tweeted about this. It's a guilty pleasure of mine to follow this story because it's fascinating. Shoigu is now using his power to undercut Prigozhin. So Wagner can no longer recruit from prisons. There were rumors that the MOD was deliberately, at least from Prigozhin's point of view, that the MOD was deliberately slowing down the delivery of weapons to Wagner that they needed for Bakhmut. It has escalated as Prigozhin has attacked Shoigu's leadership, Gerasimov's leadership, Shoigu's family. The response was kind of immediate. Like they started doing really petty stuff, like removing Prigozhin's telephones from his office so he can't call the Ministry of Defense, or pulling the badges from Wagner people so they can't access the building. I mean, just really petty stuff. The thing to keep in mind about this drama, it is dysfunctional, but none of these players are complaining about Putin himself and his ultimate leadership of the country. And as long as that's not happening, you know, and this is not my area, but I read those who do know these things. If the subordinates are squabbling, it actually serves him because everyone's a little bit off balance. And, you know, they don't know, you know, where he is on this and who he's going to support. And so I view it as a mechanism to keep people off balance, but it's not a good look. It's not cohesive. There's real tensions. And I guess ultimately where I come down on it is mercenaries are still illegal inside Russia. Wagner is operating out in the open, but anytime the Kremlin decides to end this, we might be looking at a repeat of what happened to the Slavonic Corps about 10 years ago. They stepped off a plane after being, you know, in the Middle East and doing things, stepped off a plane in Domodedovo, and then all of a sudden they were arrested and they don't exist anymore because it's illegal to be a mercenary. So if the Kremlin wanted to, and they're not there, they could make Wagner go away. But they're not. Wagner plays a role.
That is fascinating. Speaking of Wagner, and maybe this is not a direct link, but we had that horrendous video that is out there, a couple of videos. I don't want to get into it in great detail because it's very, very disturbing. But video, the worst, I think, was the video of what looks like a Ukrainian soldier being decapitated alive by a Russian soldier. I guess I'd have to ask, again, these, you know, terrible things happen during war, but this is also an information war. And that video is all over the place in, let's say, at least on Telegram in Russia. And it raises the question, why? I mean, it makes Russia, if they are the ones who did it, you know, look like monsters. So why would they want that video out there?
Yeah, so, you know, and I won't speak about the traumatic content, and I highly advise anyone listening, I just, this one, I think you should skip. You know, there's certain things that you can unsee, and you can sustain traumas from this. Unless it's your job to look at it, I would, you know, I recommend not getting involved. There's some early analysis of the video that suggests that it was Wagner and not necessarily line troops, but like until there's like an official, you know, conclusion from the Ukrainians or, you know, digital forensics that are definitive on that point, I don't know which group that it was. We have seen, and these are like details that I'm angry that I have to know these things, but I do know them. Like Wagner has a history of decapitating people that extends back to Syria, to Libya, I think parts of Africa. Like this is kind of what they do sometimes. And so, I mean, it's horrific. In terms of why it's being disseminated, I think it's not just on Telegram and Russian social media that's being disseminated. People are talking about it on Russian state media. And they're saying things like, well, you know, we're not monsters, but war makes people monsters, and these kind of false statements. And it's almost like desensitizing people and bonding them to trauma, because then you're bonded together. And we're all in this now. Like it's that kind of, you know, that kind of thing. And this is a very toxic, I mean, this is toxic psychology at work. And I'm not trained in any of this, but like, that's my interpretation of what's happening. Like we're all in this now together. And that's my interpretation. And then there's also the psychological impact, against Ukrainians of, look what I'll do to you. But I think it's backfiring, because now the Ukrainians have known what is possible here and the cruelty under occupation. And it makes them, it just coalesces their resistance.
Yeah, disturbing, but thanks for that and for the warning looking at the video. So I want to have one question more perhaps, and then I do want to open it up to questions from the audience. So remember, if you have any questions, please put them in Q&A and I'll check them and we'll begin with questions. But kind of one big overlying issue is, of course, how this ends, or at least what could we be looking at during the end of 2023 for this entire year. And right from the beginning, almost, a lot of people were predicting that this will, grind on in a stalemate for a very, very long time, until maybe each side is depleted of weapons or of fighters. What do you think? I know it's very difficult to look down down in the future, but where do you think we are headed with this, Dara?
So, my crystal ball is just a crystal ball. It is not the answer, but I can tell you a few factors that I'm looking at. And if my friend Mike Kaufman was here, I would say a war is contingent. But it really is. So there's a lot going on through the spring and through the summer, and we don't know the outcome of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. We don't know what that will do to the Ukrainian force. We don't know what that will do to the Russian force yet. Counteroffensives are hard. Offensives are hard in this war. I can't predict when and where and how that will turn out. I do know from the Russian side, they are preparing for a long-term struggle here, whether that is mobilizing more people, which I do anticipate this year. It's just a question for me of how they do it, whether it's slow, low-level call-ups to try to keep a lid on it and keep it under the radar, or they do another large replenishment in the fall and take the political risk to do it. In terms of, sorry, I'm borrowing a conference room. Someone just tried to come in, but we're all good now. On what the Ukrainians will look like after their counteroffensive. How many losses will they have? What will have to be replenished and rebuilt? So I can't really predict that. I know there are some views out there that this will end in a stalemate. I think that that's probably the closest answer. Neither side has a lot of powerful offensive capabilities, but I do want to leave open the door that there could be some surprises here. The Russians could change and adapt. The Ukrainians could find and exploit that weakness and cause a bunch of chaos behind the lines on the Russian side. So we're just going to have to sit tight, I think. I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but there really are a lot of things in play right now.
Yeah, I think we'll turn to Q&A because we have some good questions, but I want to kind of put a marker for that behind the lines, because I think that's another really interesting part of this, that Ukrainians, although most of the time they will not admit that it was them, that they have been taking action behind the lines, actually in Russia proper. And that is really significant. But let me turn to questions. Again, we're putting them in the Q&A. So the first one is from Richard Arnold, and he says, one of my research interests concerns the volunteer Cossack battalions fighting for Russia. Is there any evidence that you're allowed to share that these battalions perform differently than regular military battalions, either better or worse?
So I haven't been watching the Cossacks specifically, but I know there's a great deal of variation in these groups. There's groups like, Rusich, which it is a neo-Nazi group. There's not really a way to describe this. It's fighting in Ukraine. It's been there from the beginning. There were Kadyrov's forces who had their own capabilities and own fighting style. Their view they're still present, but their roles have changed significantly. They're not at the leading edge anymore. But to answer your question on the Cossacks, I don't actually have too much insight on them specifically.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, the next question is actually something I'm sure is on the minds of a lot of people. What is your assessment of the, and this is from Nigel Lee, what is your assessment of the recent Pentagon intelligence leak? What are the ramifications of this for Ukraine and Russia on the battlefield?
Sure. So my policy is that I'm not going to talk about any of the content of the leaks. So nevertheless, they're out there, like they're there now. So really, the issue to me will be watching the Russian side to see how they cope with this information and see how they adapt. But that's probably really all I can get into.
Okay, well, understood. Let's move on to William Mitchell, who's asking, in the near term, 6 to 9 months, what does the picture look like for the Russian force regeneration? Are we going to see Russian combat power stay at current levels, or is it going to get significantly stronger or weaker?
Yes, so that's also something that I'm looking at. There's that, you know, what is the rational thing to do versus what is the dysfunctional thing to do, which we always have to, separate, I think, when thinking about how this particular organization has made decisions in wartime recently. The Russians have been, let's take a step back here. The Russian army that started the war in 2022 is basically not there anymore. So they've lost a lot of their best equipment. A lot of their professional contractniki or contract service personnel have either been wounded, killed, or resigned, or they're continuing to fight with 300 plus days combat, which is not good. It degrades your performance over time. They have tried to replenish these losses with older equipment taken from strategic reserves out in Siberia, with mobilization, trying to entice people with benefits to sign up. That is a process that's ongoing. They're actually burning through a lot of those strategic reserves. I've been watching them haul them out of Siberia now since the summer of last year. At some point, there's not a lot of functional equipment left. That is to say, I haven't seen any evidence that there's this great lurking, powerful Russian army fist that's, sitting somewhere east of the Ural Mountains ready to come in. Someone would have found it by now. I think it's just really degraded. What does that mean for the future? A cautionary note that I would say is that, the Russian ground forces are degraded. The personnel, there's still millions more. If they want to, Shoigu has already put a marker on the map. I have millions of people that I could pull. Like, these people don't mean very much. I mean, if I'm being frank, like, it's a resource that they would commit. That being said, the Russian Air Force is still intact, and I do worry about it. What are they keeping it in reserve for? What's next? Long-term regeneration, I think they're going to make a dysfunctional choice, which they've already talked about, of increasing the size of the Russian military to 1.5 million people, having an astronomically high number of professional enlisted. I think the number is over 500,000. It's not possible. What I think this ultimately might mean, as they transition back to divisions, they're going to start ordering a reconstitution of the army. And I think there probably is going to lead them to larger conscription waves in the future, which, given Russia's demographic situation, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. That's the road that they're on right now, at least with this particular leadership team.
And just to be sure, so that partial mobilization in September was 300,000, right?
Yes.
Okay, and the mobilization now, of course, it's not mobilization. What am I saying?
Yes, yes.
Do we know how many people they want to get in uniform this time?
Right, so they have initiated a recruiting drive for professional enlisted service, and they want, I think they said 400,000 by the end of this year. That won't happen. It's never worked like that in Russia. In the last 10, 12 years that they've been doing this, it won't happen. And then when they don't get the numbers that they need, then they'll initiate the mobilization again. I just don't know if it will be low level again, like, try to keep it spread out so that people, don't get up in arms about it, or they do another big round, which is more politically risky.
Yeah. There's a question from Christopher Woody. We are led into this question very well. Given the scale of Russian losses in Ukraine, what do you think the long-term consequences will be for Moscow's military modernization plans, particularly its Navy, which is a little different? What do you think?
Yeah, so, I think, again, they have some plans that they've put markers down for right now, but, that's under Shoigu and Gerasimov. Eventually, those two will be retired. What will the next leadership team do? There's a tendency every time there's a big switch out that they modify things. Right now, it seems like they're focusing on replenishing missiles that they've expended and trying to rapidly refit the army, potentially with older models of equipment. So not your Armada tanks, not your T-90s, but like T-72s, crank them out, BMP-2s, fast and cheap. Don't need a lot of electronics because sanctions are impacting them. So, there's a lot in flux on this, and their needs are significant in those areas. Now, what does that mean for the Navy? The Navy has been a bill payer for some of the other services in Russia. So there is a point where they can't continue to delay construction of ships, because then you start doing permanent harm to the industry itself. So they have a lot of concerns that they're going to have to balance. The Russian Navy is still mostly intact, with the exception of the Moskva, frankly. The Air Force is still intact. The strategic triad is still intact. So if they're trying to allocate, with real challenges to the funds that they have available, I think they're probably going to divert resources into rebuilding the army and rebuilding missiles, probably at the expense, at least of the general purpose Navy, not the strategic part, the nuclear part.
Interesting. There's kind of an allied question here from Roxana Gabidulina. And she says, can you discuss how Russia's bases and troops outside of Russia have been affected? She says, I heard that bases in Central Asia, for example, were emptied out, and Armenia is dissatisfied with Russia's lack of support. And then, so in other words, the second question, which is really kind of the same, what are the ramifications for Russia's military cooperation with other countries? Have they stopped their military exercises, arms sales, et cetera? I'm presuming this is not China. Maybe we ought to do China separately, but feel free to answer.
Sure, and that's something that I think hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but Russia has really made itself vulnerable globally. It's not really operating abroad in too many areas, beyond Syria and Central Asia and the occupied parts of Georgia. But those bases are vulnerable. They started pulling people from them early on last year. So if we're talking about the 4th and 7th military bases in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they took contract personnel out of there a long time ago. They took equipment out of there. I don't have the precise counts for what remains. I'm sure they left like a rump element. I'd say they probably took personnel out of the Central Asian bases. I don't know what kind of equipment that they would pull from there, because it'd be hard to get it back. I just haven't looked specifically at those facilities lately to know that, but I know the personnel are gone. Syria, or not gone, but a lot of them are gone. Syria is mostly an air dominant force, so I don't think that has been significantly impacted in the way that some of the army bases have been. But yeah, no. What if there's a crisis in Georgia? Russia doesn't have a lot of combat power down there anymore. What if there's a big issue in Armenia or Tajikistan? What are they going to do? I mean, special forces have been decimated inside Ukraine. The VDV is fighting to still exist corporately right now. It's taken significant damages. If something went sideways in one of those locations, they have a real limited ability to deal with it.
We also have Callum McPhee talking about Transnistria, and it's kind of allied here. What's the probability for military involvement in Transnistria?
So I would say that the Russian, like without exaggeration, that the Russian forces in Transnistria are probably the least capable in all of the Russian army. They're just kind of isolated. The equipment is not great. From my understanding, that hasn't really shifted in recent years. I don't think that they're an operational player. I think it is a distraction though, and Russia is more than happy to like suggest that Transnistria is going to get involved to keep the Ukrainians off balance, keep Moldova off balance. But in terms of a fighting force, I think it has very little combat power to it, an ability to actually get to where it needs to go.
Dara, I think we've got the groupies now out there in the audience.
Oh.
I always think of them, this is not my area of expertise. So when we get into what I call the military groupies, they're really fantastic. And I think they follow you and some other people whom we know quite well.
Okay.
Mike,
hi. Hi, folks.
But there's one question from Terry Quist. I'll give a couple of them, but there's one overall one from Matt London, but I will save that for just a couple of minutes from now. So Terry Quist is asking, could you please speak to the degradation and sometimes open disgruntlement of elite forces like the paratroopers and naval infantry, the Marines? In some cases, they have published open protests or even mutinied. One paratrooper major defected with his damning war diary.
Yes, so we have seen a lot of these videos coming out, and the thing that I would note, just kind of off the top from them, is that the complaints are very carefully calibrated. Like they don't. Most of those videos aren't saying things like, "We shouldn't be in this war. Why are we here? The Kremlin is terrible to have sent us here. We don't want to fight. We quit, like, I don't want to be in the army or VDV anymore." It's more like, you're not giving me the equipment that I need to do my job. I can't do my job under these circumstances, or my command is corrupt and failing. I need to serve under like command, or I'm sure you, Vladimir Vladimirovich, don't understand that we don't have food, hats, or ammunition, but I'm sure if you did know that, you would fix this, right? Like it's an appeal almost to the czar, because that is a safe form of protest, because they're not complaining about the purpose of why they're there or who sent them there in this state in the first place, which is of course true, and I suspect they know that, but and they're not saying they don't want to fight necessarily. They want to fight under like proper circumstances. There are some who are defectors, like true defectors who have left Russia. They've left service when it was still possible for them last year. And they are telling stories once they've left Europe about things that they've witnessed, things that they've been a part of, like torture and imprisonment of Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian service personnel. We're learning a lot from those defector accounts. There's not that many defector accounts. It's a small percentage. In terms of what is the impact to the fronts, I think for some reason, I think it's worse. It's the worst in Donetsk, because they've subordinated a lot of these mobilized people directly to local commanders who are not Russian. And there's a lot of bad relations in between them, and they're being used as cannon fodder. That particular part of the front, I think, is the closest to entire units at the squad level or remnants of the company level. I've seen those videos where they're just like, we're done. We're not fighting anymore. We're not doing this. The question is, how widespread is that? And are the Russians going to adapt and fix this, or are they just going to send those people as cannon fodder because they complained, and then they've resolved the complaints in a very like dark, cynical way. Yeah, no, it's a mess in general. It's a mess.
Great and very basic question from Kelly Smith. What can you say about the state of the Russian defense industry? We know Ukraine is very short on munitions. What about Russia?
The Russian defense base had a lot of problems before the war, had a lot of bottlenecks in it. We know now from cracking open these advanced missiles that they're using subcomponents and parts from the West. Sanctions are going to take a bite out of that. Russia's not going to stop trying to find Western subcomponents for their equipment. They're just going to find, different types of shell companies and mechanisms to get after these things, potentially look at other markets that maybe don't have the quality that they need, but they need chips. That's one thing. There is a production bottleneck issue that no amount of reading Stalin telegrams or wearing a leather trench coat is going to fix. There's only, essentially one factory in Russia that produces tanks. Like, it can only crank out so many per year. There's no alternative factory that can suddenly be, snapped into place and can start cranking things out. That being said, Russia's defense industrial base is intact. It functions. And now a bunch of money and federal resources are being devoted against it to try to get more juice out of the system. I think they'll get a little bit. They're clearly working towards that goal, but they're doing it with threats, and the threats are outweighing the capacity right now. And I think we should keep in mind the capacity limitations are very real and long-term.
Mm-hmm. There's a question here from Matt London, and it is, I must admit, kind of detailed, but I'll give you the headlines, let's say. And it deals with what happens in the future and a potential deal. So if the Ukraine spring-summer offensive ends only moderately successful and cannot take control of Melitopol, for example, could you imagine a grand deal along these lines? Russia uses its frozen funds to buy Crimea, in other words, to maintain control. Ukraine goes into the EU and NATO. Of course, I don't think it's going to go into NATO soon, or Western security guarantees. And then these areas, Kherson and Zaporizhia, back to Ukraine, a deal on Donbass. We can get into the weeds on this, but I think what Matt is talking about is, some type of eventual resolution of this that could entail deal making. So I guess maybe we simplify it by saying, do you think that there can be this complex, tit for tat kind of trading areas, because President Zelensky of Ukraine is constantly reminded by, the sentiment among his fellow Ukrainians that they are not going to give up any land that has been taken by Russia. They want it back. And President Putin is showing no sign of being open to any type of deal. So that's a long-winded way of posing this question to you. I'm sorry, Dara.
Oh, no. I may ask you that question, Jill. Do you to take a crack at this one? Because I just follow the forces. And, in terms of understanding where the Zelensky government is and where the Putin government is not something I focus on day to day. But it seems to me that the Zelensky government is very clear that after everything that's happened to them over the past year, 15 months, they will, it just doesn't seem like he's in a place where he would ever give away his territory to live under Russian occupation, because it's so horrible. Like, the outcomes are so horrible for Ukrainian civilians. That seems to me where the Zelensky government is. I would defer to you. If there's any, what their thinking is on a future arrangement. Russia, for its part, also, and let me use more specific words, Putin does not show the willingness to back down from this now.
Mhm.
You know, I think that the sunk costs are high. Um, I don't, and again, I don't follow, you know, diplomacy. I'm speaking to a bunch of diplomats, so I'm feeling very nervous, you know, doing it. Um, I don't see how either two of these two particular governments are going to find middle ground. If, you know, there was a change on the Russian side and it wasn't Putin, it was it was a different face, maybe not a different mind. What does that do? I don't know. So I would actually like to pose that question back to you, if that's all right, Jill. Like, what do you see when you look forward here?
Well, I think we're both on the same page here that neither side looks as if it wants to bend in any way. So that would dictate or seem to dictate, barring something really unexpected, a long dragged out process getting to the end. Now, eventually, there might have to be some type of negotiation, but my real feeling is that both sides will have to be exhausted. And the side that, it's almost like, remember we talked about Tolstoy and, you know, war and peace, war dictating peace, that the side that is able to hold out the longest with both weaponry and sadly with people, with human lives, will win. Because I just don't see either side. On the Ukrainian side, it's kind of democracy in action, that these are you know, citizens of Ukraine who feel that their land has been taken from them. And as you mentioned, occupation has been extremely brutal in the cities that were taken by Russians. And so they will not give it up unless something happens. And Putin, I'm convinced, because he has staked everything on this misbegotten war, that he will take it to the end. Or the only thing about Putin that I always remember is he is able to switch and change and maybe rejigger something so that he will claim that he won and end it in that way. I used to think that more than I do now, because I'm not quite sure how he does that. But there could be a way that he says, I won. And then he eventually goes home. But I think, I don't want to get too far into this, but I don't think going home will ever really happen. I think that there will be other ways that Putin will try to undermine Ukraine, undermine the region, undermine the West. That would be, you know, not kinetic fighting, but many other ways that we know about, hybrid methods of undermining the West and Ukraine. So anyway, it's very hard right now. And I think everybody is troubled by this. Right now, you know, we don't know where the fighting is exactly headed. And so this could just continue to drag on. And as wars drag on, unpredictable things happen. You know, I just wanted, we have like 5 more minutes. And I think I'd like to ask kind of a question similar to that one about what about the region? And it's specific, but it kind of gets into the danger here. If you look at the Baltic area, we are constantly, almost every day, seeing overflying national territory, getting very close to the border with NATO and Russia. And some of this is very dangerous. I mean, we've already had one encounter that, you know, with a drone, a NATO drone, US drone, that was not shot down by the Russians, but almost forced to be taken down. So what is your concern, Dara, about the tangential effects of this war heating up the possibility of really dangerous confrontations outside of Ukraine?
Yeah, no, I think it's a real possibility, and we've done some research on at RAND on, we call it Russian coercive signaling. You know, the different mechanisms that they use military assets to coerce, aggressively come after military assets that are operating in areas that they don't want them to be in. violating airspace, doing unsafe and unprofessional maneuvers in the air and the sea. These kind of issues tend to spike in times of tension, and we've been in a sustained period of tension with Russia for a while. It's especially dicey up in the Baltic Sea because the countries are very close together. There's a lot of, airspaces, and sometimes, it's the Russians are trying to go to Kaliningrad, and they cut corners on their way down there on what we call milk runs, which are just supplies from Russia to Kaliningrad that are airborne. Other times they do it deliberately to trigger scrambles and everything like that. The Reaper incident last month, was it? Time is going so quickly now, I'm losing track of time. That was a very aggressive incident that we hadn't really seen from them before, where they're trying to dump fuel on one of our assets to get it ingested in the engine, make it combust potentially, or try to do aftershocks on the top of it to make the wings reverberate and potentially cause structural problems. It did result in that asset having to come down. And, the Russians now have learned from this experience, oh, okay, I know how to do this now. And it really angers the Americans when I do it. So what happens if I do it again? That being said, I don't think it's going to change our behavior from what it was prior to this incident. We're still going to fly Reaper flights, and we're still going to abide by the rules that international waters and international airspace belong to everyone, and you're expected to follow certain rules of the road. But yeah, no, I think we're going to see a lot more of this behavior. It's like I think of it almost as like theatrics and antics, where people are doing, like, they're relieving tension by doing these kind of things, but they actually serve a purpose. And in Russian thinking, it's, I'm going to do all these maneuvers around you so that that I'm a pilot and I have these skills, that I carry weapons with me. All these things are part of their deterrence strategy. The problem is, now that the Russian military is becoming exhausted, pilots get exhausted, equipment gets worn out. The potential for mistakes to happen in this environment go up.
Yeah, dangerous. You know what? We've got 2 more minutes, but I think we can squeeze in one last question. But it's a huge question coming from Noah Lord. But I think trying to keep it short, but because who knows? But assuming the war ends in some form of stalemate, how do you envision Europe's future security structure? What role might Ukraine and Russia have in it? It's really an important question, but I know it's tough.
Yeah, no, that is the question that we all have to think about and put action plans in place right now. It's been my experience that when something really bothers Russia and they don't have an answer for it, they don't talk about it. And right now, the thing I think them not talking about is NATO expansion. And they've made some complaints about Finland. They've made some pretty acidic comments about it, but all in all, it's been quieter than I expected. And I think it's because they don't have a solution. They don't have an army available anymore right now, temporarily, that can go up there and deploy to the border. Everything is committed to Ukraine and damaged in a significant way. I think they could make some posture enhancements, maybe with the Air Force, the Northern Fleets up there. But I think this is a really big issue, and it's an embarrassing policy failure for the Russians. The NATO's border has just expanded in a significant way on them. So, that's an issue. The question will be, moving forward, now we know, we have known, but now there's no way anyone can look away from it. Russian intent is hostile. Their capabilities are temporarily disrupted. So they're going to take time to rebuild what they've lost in Ukraine. It's going to take them years, depending on how the economy breaks and how they prioritize things, and whether the corruption and dysfunction in their system is manageable or not. But they will recapitalize over time. So we have a bit of time as NATO and our partners in Europe to think about what we're going to do to respond to this threat, because one day they're going to reconstitute. What do we do with it? What do we need to put in place now? So it's a really big question. We have a little bit of time till they rebuild, but we have to start making decisions.
Boy, this has been a great discussion. Thank you so much, Dara Massicot. Really fantastic. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the questions from the audience. They were really top notch. And just a reminder, we've got 2 more in this series. One, the next one definitely will be on China vis-a-vis Ukraine. So that will be interesting. We're going to try to do that pretty soon here, but we'll notify all our patient and, patriotic, interested listeners. I shouldn't say patriotic, but passionate is what I meant, followers. And I hope you can join that. And finally, again, thanks very much to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its generous support of this, and hope to see you at another session soon.
Thanks, everybody.